Imagine this: if the United States, the most powerful superpower of the modern world, were suddenly brought to its knees, not by an alliance of nations, not by a vast empire, but by a single man. For ancient Rome, that man was Hannibal. From the time he was a boy in Carthage, Hannibal swore an oath of eternal hatred against Rome, and that oath transformed him into the greatest military genius of his age, the man who led tens of thousands of soldiers, along with war elephants, across the snow-covered Alps, striking terror to the very heart of Italy. Every battle he fought was a catastrophe for Rome, from Trebia to Trasimene to Cannae, where an entire Roman army was annihilated to the last man. But the story of Hannibal is not just one of fire and blood. It is the story of genius and ambition, of betrayal and political intrigue, and above all, a lesson about the razor-thin line between glorious triumph and catastrophic ruin. There was a moment, just one step away, when Hannibal might have erased Rome from the map, and with it, changed the course of all human history. This is not just the tale of a general. This is the story of the greatest nightmare Rome ever faced. The story of Hannibal, the nightmare of Rome. Before Hannibal became Rome's greatest nightmare, we must go back in time to understand his homeland, Carthage. Located where modern-day Tunis stands on the North African coast, Carthage began as a small Phoenician trading post. But with its powerful navy and trade routes stretching across the Mediterranean, Carthage quickly grew into one of the wealthiest and most prosperous centers of the ancient world. Controlling key islands such as Corsica, Sardinia, and Sicily, Carthage often stood as Rome's equal and at times even its superior. It was in this context that a figure rose to prominence: Hannibal Barca, Hannibal's father. He was one of Carthage's greatest generals during the First Punic War. Hamilcar was not only a warrior, but also a father consumed by a deep hatred for Rome. Legend tells that before setting out to conquer the Iberian Peninsula, he brought his young son to a temple, placed his hand on the altar, and made him swear an eternal oath of enmity against Rome. That oath, etched into his destiny, would shape Hannibal's entire life. From then on, Hannibal's childhood was unlike that of any other child. He grew up in army camps, surrounded by the clash of swords and the smoke of battle. From his teenage years, Hannibal was trained in the arts of war, riding horses, commanding troops, mastering strategy, and before long, even the most seasoned soldiers marveled at the boy's natural brilliance. Hannibal did not just learn the art of war, he was born to command it. Much like Alexander the Great, who from youth was trained to become the conqueror of the Greek world, Hannibal revealed his genius from warfare at an early age. He was the embodiment of destiny, the man chosen to challenge Rome. Hannibal grew up bound by a blood oath, never to cease hating Rome. And as he came of age, that oath quickly turned into action. From Iberia, Hannibal expanded his power, building a formidable army battle-hardened, experienced, and ready to make history. In 219 BC, he chose Saguntum as his target. This small city was an ally of Rome, yet it lay deep within Carthaginian territory. To Hannibal, this was an outright provocation. He besieged the city. After 8 long months, Saguntum fell. Rome erupted in fury. They sent an ultimatum to Carthage: surrender Hannibal or face war. But the Carthaginian Senate, unwilling to sacrifice the young general who was bringing them victory and wealth, made a fateful choice. They placed Carthage's destiny in Hannibal's hands. And so, the Second Punic War officially began. But Hannibal had no intention of waiting for Rome to come to him. Instead, he resolved to strike at the very heart of the enemy with a plan that still astonishes historians to this day: the crossing of the Alps. Picture it. Before him loomed a colossal wall of snow-capped mountains, towering, frigid, merciless. Tens of thousands of soldiers trudged along narrow paths, battered by blizzards and sheer cliffs. The mighty war elephant symbols of Carthaginian strength shivered under the brutal cold, collapsing one by one. Bodies of men and beasts lay scattered in the snow. Every step forward was bought with sacrifice. And yet, through blood, through ice, through death itself, Hannibal achieved the impossible. After weeks of suffering, when Rome still believed no army could ever cross the Alps, Suddenly, out of the Po Valley, Hannibal emerged. He had not only crossed the mountains, he appeared like a phantom from a nightmare, standing in the very heart of Italy. From that moment, Rome realized it was facing an enemy unlike any it had ever known before. Hannibal, the man bound by an oath of hatred since childhood, had brought the war to their very gates. When Hannibal appeared in northern Italy, Rome immediately dispatched its armies to block him. But what they did not realize was that they were about to face a military genius, one who understood their weaknesses better than they did themselves. The Battle of the Trebia, winter 218 BC. Rome's two consuls shared command. Scipio, cautious and still recovering from a wound, and Sempronius, hot-tempered and desperate for glory before his term ended. Hannibal knew this and set the perfect trap. On a freezing morning, the Roman army was lured across the icy waters of the Trebia River, chest deep and weighed down by soaked armor. Exhausted and shivering, they stumbled onto the opposite bank only to be met by Hannibal's full assault. And just as the Romans struggled to hold their line, a hidden detachment led by Hannibal's brother Mago suddenly struck from the rear. The Roman formation collapsed. Around 20,000 were killed or captured, while the rest fled in chaos. It was not merely a defeat, it was a massacre. But Rome's nightmare was only beginning. 6 months later, the Battle of Lake Trasimene, 217 BC. Once again, Hannibal demonstrated his audacity. He lured the Roman army into a narrow pass, mountains on one side, the vast lake on the other, as a thick fog settled over the land. The Romans believed Hannibal was ahead of them, unaware that his entire army lay in ambush along the ridges above. When the signal trumpets blared, Carthaginian troops poured down from the hills. The Romans were caught completely off guard, pressed between sword and water. Many panicked, plunging into the lake in a desperate attempt to escape, only to drown beneath the weight of their armor. The result? About 15,000 Romans killed, thousands more captured, and the rest scattered. To this day, it remains one of the largest and most successful ambushes in military history. To put this into perspective, it was like Pearl Harbor twice over but on land within just 2 years. That was the scale of devastation Hannibal inflicted on Rome. In the eyes of the Romans, Hannibal was no longer just a general. He had become a living nightmare, a phantom haunting the very gates of their city. After Trebia and Trasimene, Rome was plunged into panic. But instead of surrendering, they placed all their faith and resources into a single massive force, the largest army Rome had ever assembled, 86,000 soldiers. Command was shared between the two consuls, Varro and Aemilius Paulus, alternating day by day. And Hannibal knew well that of the two, Varro was the weak link, impulsive, overconfident, and reckless. August 2nd, 216 BC, Cannae. That day, Varro held command. Convinced that sheer numbers would crush Carthage, he massed his men into a dense block and hurled them straight at Hannibal's center. But that was exactly what Hannibal wanted. He arranged his troops in a convex line bulging outward. As the Romans surged forward, Hannibal's center deliberately gave ground, slowly bending into a crescent. Step by step, the Romans were being drawn deeper into the trap without realizing it. Then came the decisive moment. From both flanks, Hannibal's elite infantry closed in. His cavalry, having routed the Roman horsemen, swept back to strike from the rear. In an instant, the entire Roman army was surrounded on all four sides, packed so tightly they could scarcely lift their swords. Men suffocated in their own ranks. By nightfall, an estimated 50,000 to 60,000 Romans lay dead, with tens of thousands more captured, among them over 80 senators and the consul Aemilius Paulus himself. After the victory, Hannibal's brother Mago carried a massive jar filled with gold rings taken from the slain Roman nobles and poured them out before the Carthaginian Senate. That chilling image became the symbol of the catastrophe Rome had suffered at Cannae. For the military world, Cannae was more than a battle, it was a masterpiece. For over 2,000 years, from West Point in the United States to Sandhurst in Britain, the battle has been taught as the ultimate example of the perfect encirclement, a smaller army, through strategy and cunning, annihilating a vastly larger foe. For Rome, the name Hannibal now transcended fear. He became a living nightmare, a whispered curse that shook the foundations of the Republic whenever they recalled their greatest defeat. After the catastrophe at Cannae, many believed that Hannibal needed only to march on Rome itself, and the city would fall. Even today, historians still regard his decision not to attack Rome as the greatest mistake of his career. But Hannibal saw things differently. In his eyes, conquering the city was not the ultimate goal. Instead, he believed that if he could make Rome's Italian allies defect, shatter its network of alliances, and cut off its supplies of food and resources, then Rome would be forced to negotiate peace. Victory to Hannibal did not mean seizing the walls of Rome, it meant forcing the Republic to admit defeat. But here, Hannibal misjudged his enemy. Rome was not an ordinary state, it was a nation at total war, a society where every life, every resource, was bound to the cause of victory. Better to see the city burn to ashes than to surrender. And it was this spirit that gave Rome the resilience Hannibal could never break. In their darkest hour, the Romans turned to one man with absolute power, Fabius Maximus. He was unlike any general before him. He did not seek dazzling victories or a decisive clash with Hannibal. Instead, he chose a strategy that earned him ridicule as a coward: delay. Fabius refused direct battle. He shadowed Hannibal's movements, avoided large engagements, harassed supply lines, and slowly wore down Carthage's strength. If Hannibal was the master of battlefield brilliance, then Fabius became the father of Roman guerrilla warfare, sowing the seeds of a style of war built on endurance, patience, and the promise of eventual reversal. Rome learned to endure pain, to accept loss, all in anticipation of the moment of revenge. And that endurance became the turning point that would ultimately seal Hannibal's downfall. For nearly 2 decades of rampaging across Italy, Hannibal faced not only Rome's armies, but another far more insidious enemy, the indifference and greed of Carthage itself. While he racked up victory after victory, the Carthaginian Senate refused to send reinforcements, refused to send supplies, refused to give him the forces he needed to turn triumphs into final conquest. Hannibal, the military genius of Carthage, was, in truth, fighting alone. He had only what he could build inside Italy itself: a few local allies, a handful of cities that defected from Rome, and an army growing ever more weary in a war with no end. Rome, meanwhile, despite defeat after defeat, revealed its true strength: the strength of a nation utterly committed to total war. They accepted loss, they embraced suffering, but they never surrendered. For Rome, every defeat was a lesson, every death a sacrifice for the survival of the Republic. Gradually, Rome adapted. In Sicily, they recaptured the island, cutting off Carthage's vital foothold in the Mediterranean. In Iberia, they launched a series of campaigns, striking at the very lands that fed Carthage with gold and silver, the stronghold once carved out by Hannibal's father, Hannibal Barca. Step by step, Rome drained the lifeblood that sustained Hannibal's army. And in this pivotal moment, a new figure emerged, the man history would call Hannibal's mirror: Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Scipio Africanus. At the time, Scipio was only a young commander, but he grasped a truth few others could see: Rome could never defeat Hannibal by fighting the old way. Scipio began to watch, to study, even to imitate the very tactics that had once destroyed Rome: mobility, flexibility, the art of turning one's own weakness into a trap for the enemy. If Hannibal was a master of ambush, Scipio learned to ambush. If Hannibal exploited recklessness, Scipio learned to exploit arrogance. And unlike Hannibal, Scipio was never abandoned. He had an entire republic at his back, pouring men, weapons, and supplies into his cause, giving him everything he needed to turn the tide. Gradually, Scipio became a reflection of Hannibal, but with one deadly advantage: He was the Roman Hannibal, powered by a relentless war machine. Rome began to believe that if anyone could stand against Hannibal, it was Scipio. And from that moment, the balance of the war began to shift. The question was no longer, how will Hannibal destroy Rome? But rather, how will Rome finally destroy Hannibal? After 15 years of terrorizing Italy, Hannibal was finally summoned home. For the first time since his childhood, he returned to Carthage. But when he set foot on the land his father once defended, Hannibal did not return as a conqueror, he returned as the last hope of a dying empire. While he had waged war in Italy, Carthage had withered. The silver of Iberia had been seized by Rome. The once mighty fleet lay in ruins. Allies had abandoned them one by one. And now the enemy he had once made tremble stood at the very gates of Carthage, led by a young commander who carried Hannibal's own legacy within him, Publius Cornelius Scipio. Zama 202 BC. This was not just a battle, it was a clash between two of the greatest military minds in history. On one side, Hannibal the seasoned warrior, the symbol of Carthaginian defiance. On the other, Scipio the mirror image, who had studied Hannibal's art of war and turned it into his own weapon. Before the battle, the two are said to have met face to face. Hannibal, now older, his hair streaked with gray, warned Scipio to accept peace, reminding him that fortune in war is fickle. But Scipio refused. Rome would not stop. There was no path left but total war. When the fighting began, Hannibal unleashed the weapon that had once terrified Rome: war elephants. Dozens of massive beasts charged toward the Roman lines, trampling the earth beneath them. But Scipio had prepared meticulously. He ordered his soldiers to open wide corridors through their ranks. Instead of crushing Rome's legions, the elephants were funneled harmlessly through these gaps, cut down by volleys of spears from both sides. What had once been Carthage's symbol of power now became a burden. The infantry clash was brutal, the fighting fierce. Hannibal's veterans men who had marched with him across the Alps fought with unyielding courage. But the fatal weakness was clear. Carthage's cavalry could not match Rome's. While Hannibal struggled to hold the center, Roman horsemen, joined by their Numidian allies, swept around and struck from the rear, cutting off any chance of retreat. It was, as many have said, a mirror image of Cannae. Where once Hannibal had surrounded and destroyed a Roman army, now he himself was encircled, his forces crushed by the very tactics he had perfected. When the dust settled, the field of Zama was carpeted with the dead. The Carthaginian army lay in ruins. For the first time in his life, Hannibal was forced to retreat, to admit defeat. The consequences were devastating. Carthage was compelled to sign a peace treaty even harsher than the one after the First Punic War, surrendering its fleet, paying enormous reparations, losing nearly all of its territory, and forever stripped of the power to challenge Rome again. If Cannae had been Hannibal's greatest triumph, then Zama was his tragic end. A chapter of history closed in blood and ashes. Carthage, once master of the Mediterranean, reduced to a shadow of itself. And Hannibal, the man who had once made Rome tremble, was left as a powerless witness to his enemy's unstoppable rise to empire. After Zama, Hannibal did not vanish immediately. He returned to Carthage and entered politics, working to reform the state, repay its crushing war debt, and rebuild its shattered economy. But his very success bred jealousy. Political rivals moved against him, and under mounting pressure from Rome, Carthage ultimately betrayed its greatest son. Hannibal was forced to leave his homeland, beginning a life of exile. He found refuge first at the court of Antiochus III in the east, and later drifted to the kingdom of Bithynia on the shores of the Black Sea. Wherever he went, his name alone still struck fear into Rome, and Rome never stopped hunting him. In 181 BC, as Roman agents closed in to arrest him, Hannibal, at the age of 66, chose death on his own terms. He drank poison, refusing to be paraded in chains before the enemy who had haunted him his entire life. Thus ended the life of a military genius, a phantom who had terrified Rome for decades alone, in exile, far from his homeland, a homeland with only bitterness as his final companion. But the tragedy did not end with him. Only 35 years after his death, Carthage, though still wealthy from trade, stripped of its military strength, was finally burned to the ground in the Third Punic War, 146 BC, erased forever from the map. Hannibal and Carthage both shared the same fate, crushed beneath the iron heel of Rome. After Hannibal's death, his name did not fade from Rome's memory. On the contrary, it became an obsession, a symbol of dread. Whenever Rome faced danger, the people would whisper a phrase like an incantation. Hannibal ad portas. Hannibal is at the gates. In Roman culture, Hannibal became the boogeyman, the shadow that haunted the Republic forever. But beyond fear, he left behind an immortal legacy. For over 2,000 years, every great commander has studied him. Napoleon pored over every detail of Cannae. Julius Caesar, Robert E. Lee, each sought to recreate that perfect encirclement. Even today at West Point, Sandhurst, and every major military academy in the world, Cannae is still taught as a masterpiece, a testament to Hannibal's genius that transcended his age. Hannibal was the embodiment of boldness, brilliance, and an indomitable will. But he was also a tragedy destroyed by isolation, by political betrayal, and by the failure of his own homeland to support him. And across the centuries, one haunting question still lingers. What if Hannibal had marched on Rome after Cannae? No one can ever truly answer. But one thing is certain, the name Hannibal Barca will live forever in history as one of the greatest and most tragic military geniuses the world has ever known. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more epic tales of the legends who shaped our history.